church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and we are delighted that you're listening to our podcast today. There's some pretty interesting things, to say the least, that are going on all around us. The news cycle is just replete with startling things, and perhaps one of the most startling things was when we learned literally just a few days ago that in the middle of the night on January 2nd, President Trump ordered U.S. forces to assist the Department of Justice in bringing the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife to the United States to stand trial for federal drug trafficking charges. Now, this was a massive operation, and it involved 200 Special Forces troops and more than 50 aircraft from 20 different bases. The military assets included F-35 fighter jets and F-22 Raptors, B-52 and B-1 bombers, and various drones, and what's known as MQ-9 Reapers and D-8 Poseidon maritime patrol craft, and the AC-130J Ghost Rider aircraft. This was a large operation, significant. And the Navy's presence included the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier and the USS Iwo Jima amphibious assault ship and additional destroyers and cruisers. This operation had been planned for months. And guess what? The U.S. forces did not lose a single airplane, and no one was killed. And it's reported that there were significant casualties among the Venezuelan forces protecting Maduro. Now, if you've been watching the news, you know that the U.S. for the last several months has deployed significant military forces in the Caribbean right off the coast of Venezuela, primarily to intervene in the smuggling of cocaine and fentanyl in the United States. It's been estimated that more than 15,000 military personnel have been deployed in the Caribbean off the coast of Venezuela. Venezuela? Yes, Venezuela, considered to be a prominent source of trafficking of these drugs to the U.S. Now, what has led up to this raid on Venezuela? Well, let me just go over just a little bit of history, maybe to give you a little understanding. Nicolas Maduro became president of Venezuela following Cesar Chavez's death in 2013, and he declared a victory in the presidential election in 2018. And then in 2019, the National Assembly of Venezuela invoked the Venezuelan Constitution and declared that Maduro had usurped power and was not the president of Venezuela. And since 2019, more than 50 countries, listen to that, more than 50 countries, including the United States, have refused to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's head of state. And then in July 24, just a little more than a year ago, in the Venezuelan presidential election, Maduro again declared himself the victor in spite of ample evidence to the contrary. And yes, the United States again joined many other countries in refusing to recognize Maduro as the legitimately elected president of the 2024 presidential election. Now, the allegations against Maduro are that he helped to manage and ultimately lead the Cartel of the Suns, a Venezuelan drug trafficking organization comprised of high-ranking Venezuelan officials. And as he gained power in Venezuela, Maduro apparently participated in corrupt and violent narco-terrorism conspiracy with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. This group, a designated foreign terrorist organization. And then it's alleged that Maduro negotiated multiple shipments of Colombia-produced cocaine and directed the Cartel of the Suns to provide military-grade weapons to the Colombians. That he coordinated with narcotic traffickers in Honduras and other countries to facilitate large-scale drug trafficking, and solicited the assistance from Colombian leadership in training militia groups that functioned as an armed force unit for this Cartel of the Suns. Well, in March 2020, during the Biden administration, Maduro was charged in the Southern District of New York with narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and a conspiracy to possess these machine guns and destructive devices. Initially, the Department of State offered a reward up to $15 million for information leading to the arrest and or conviction of Maduro. And then in January of just last year, the Department of State increased the reward to $25 million. And then in August of last year, on August 7th, the department announced another increase in the reward up to $50 million. $50 million. That should have announced to everyone that something was going to happen with this fugitive Maduro. And this $50 million level apparently was triggered when the Cartel of the Suns was designated as a global terrorist group. And as the leader of the Cartel of the Suns, Maduro is the first target in the history of the narcotics rewards program with a reward exceeding $25 million. Now, I wanted to talk about this raid in Venezuela that's placed Maduro and his wife in American jails, being subjected to the U.S. judicial system, because a poll came out on January 5th here in the U.S. that reported that only 1 in 3 Americans approved of this raid. 1 in 3. And just as we might have expected, the results found that 65% of Republicans supported the military operation, compared to only 11% of the Democrats and only 23% of independents. Now, in addition to the charges of narco-terrorism, there's been growing concern that Venezuela was becoming the greatest foreign threat to the United States. Think about that. Venezuela being identified perhaps as the greatest foreign threat to the United States. It's a country that's rich in oil production and oil reserves and precious metals, and both China and Russia were establishing footholds in this country that could lead to military capabilities really on the doorstep of the continental U.S. Now think about this. Venezuela is only 1,800 miles from the shores of Florida. A mere 1,800 miles. You know, when Trump ordered elite troops to storm a fortified compound in Caracas to capture the Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro, and he was really following historical footsteps of U.S. interventions that have toppled corrupt and evil authoritarian leaders and dictators in the past. So you kind of say, well, I guess this is not new. You know, in 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup that removed Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power and restored the Shah's authoritarian rule. And then a year later, in 1954, the CIA supported another coup to overthrow the president of Guatemala, which resulted in the military dictatorship of Carlos Armas. And then in 1963, what became a foreshadow of the Vietnam conflict, the authoritarian leader of South Vietnam was overthrown and assassinated in a CIA-backed military coup in that country. And then in October of 1983, the U.S. removed General Hudson Austin from power in Grenada, ending his military government. And perhaps the U.S.'s interdiction in another country that is most like the Venezuelan situation is when President George W.H. Bush launched what was known as Operation Just Cause, invading Panama in December of 1989, capturing Panama's President Manuel Noriega, transferring him to the United States, where he was tried and imprisoned on drug trafficking charges. In a situation very similar to Maduro, Noriega, a military dictator, had been indicted by federal grand juries in Miami and Tampa, Florida, on charges of racketeering and drug trafficking. And then more recently, just in 2003, the United States, along with England, Australia, and Poland, invaded Iraq and captured Saddam Hussein, who had ruled Iraq as a dictator for nearly 25 years. You know, Hussein, this dictator, he was tried and convicted for crimes against humanity by the Iraqi Special Tribunal and was executed by hanging in 2006. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that the United States, throughout its history, has been willing to get involved and remove evil and corrupt authoritarian leadership in other countries when they become a threat to the safety of U.S. citizens. Now, here in the United States and internationally, there's now a substantial debate about whether the United States had any legal justification to enter the country of Venezuela and arrest Maduro and his wife. Now, at first glance, one would think that alleged criminal acts occurring outside the United States could not be subject to prosecution in the United States. Now, look, I'm not an attorney, but you and I both can go to the internet and do a lot of research on this subject. And it just turns out that this assumption is not always true. You can read the opinions of highly qualified legal terms about a concept known as extraterritorial jurisdiction. Extraterritorial jurisdiction. Now, extraterritorial jurisdiction, it really is the ability to prosecute both U.S. citizens living and working abroad, as well as foreign nationals who have no connection to the United States. And our Supreme Court has set forth the test to determine whether extraterritorial jurisdiction is permitted. The Supreme Court said first, the Congress must expressly state that the law applies outside the United States. And second, even if the Congress has not expressly stated that the law has extraterritorial application, American law can still apply if the conduct relative to the law took place in the United States. The bottom line is this. And you can also go online and read this entire 25-page indictment against Maduro. I've done that. And the indictment includes narco-terrorism conspiracy and cocaine importation conspiracy. And guess what? The Congress has explicitly given extraterritorial jurisdiction when these laws are broken. Therefore, it appears that our government has followed the laws. They have followed the laws that exist in bringing in a fugitive like Maduro to justice. Now, an organization known as the Human Rights Watch, excuse me, has reported that independent observers concluded that opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez actually won the 2024 Venezuelan election by a significant margin, even though the Maduro government announced that Maduro had won. Now, following the announcement of the election results, thousands of largely peaceful protesters took to the streets to demand a fair vote. And what happened? The Venezuelan authorities responded with violence and widespread abuse. 23 protesters and bystanders died, and authorities are arbitrarily detained and prosecuted protesters and government critics, including dozens of adolescents. Today, over 20 million Venezuelans live in what we know as multidimensional poverty, which means they lack adequate access to essential goods and services and rights, including food and critical medicines. Since 2014, approximately 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country prior to these recent events. And prior to these recent events, surveys indicated that 40% of the population was considering leaving the country. Now, another thing that's much less talked about is what has happened to Christians living under the Maduro regime. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom documented patterns of harassment and arbitrary detentions, bureaucratic restrictions, and legal pressures on the faith community that refuse to support Maduro's goals. Religious leaders and lay people, they've been threatened and summoned by intelligence agents and subjected to surveillance simply because they were seen as autonomous from government control. A tragic example of this occurred in February of 2021 when armed authorities entered a Christian drug and alcohol rehab center, injuring the participants and staff, marking and beating them, and forcing them to chew the pages of Scripture. These acts of violence and harassment did not occur in isolation. Christians in Venezuela have faced direct acts of intimidation and violence, and many of the Christian leaders have been subjected to arbitrary detention and direct threats. It's been pointed out that persecution does not always arrive in dramatic headlines. It shows up in blocked registration and delayed humanitarian aid and intrusive reporting requirements. And yes, the quiet disappearance of pastors into detention cells. Some of these pastors are still absent from their congregations. Some are in exile. Some have scars that will not soon fade. Christians in Venezuela right now, in light of the recent Maduro fall, are asking for Christians around the world to pray that emerging leaders will safeguard religious freedom in their country going forward. Now, after President Trump nearly lost his life in an assassination attempt, I asserted on this podcast that the experience had changed President Trump into a man with a deeper faith in God. Last June, after the successful bombing of Iran to eliminate their ability to produce nuclear weapons, President Trump spoke to the nation, and he made it a pointed appeal to faith. He said, and I want you to just thank everybody, and in particular, God. I want to just say we love you, God, and we love our great military. Protect them. He then concluded his remarks with this: God bless the Middle East, God bless Israel, and God bless America. When Trump concluded his authorization to initiate the Venezuelan raid just a few days ago, he said this to the military leadership. He said, good luck and Godspeed. Now, I'm convinced that President Trump invoked this term Godspeed in recognition that God needed to play a role in this success. Now, I'm aware that somebody might use this term Godspeed in just a simple secular way, meaning good luck to you. But I'm not sure that that's what Trump meant. I think he invoked that term because he recognized what Psalms 22:28 reminds us, and that is for kingship belongs to the Lord, and He, God, rules over the nations. The Bible provides detailed accounts of evil authority kingdoms interacting with his chosen nation, Israel. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for centuries, and then God delivered them through Moses. The Pharaoh's heart hardened, and he refused to release the Israelites, which led to the 10 plagues that culminated in the Exodus. You can read all this for yourself in Exodus, chapters 1 through 14. The Philistines, they were a constant threat to Israel during the period that we know as the Judges. They were known for their military prowess and advanced weaponry. But God allowed them to be subdued. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Ammonites, and the Moabites and Edomites were all enemies of Israel. And the Syrians, located in Damascus, were recurrent adversaries of Israel and frequently waged war against them. The prophet Elijah played a significant role in these conflicts, demonstrating God's power over Israel's enemies. When the Israelites entered the Promised Land, they faced numerous Canaanite tribes, including the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. All these hostile enemies were used by God to fulfill purposes, sometimes as instruments of judgment and sometimes as a catalyst for repentance and renewal. But if you recall, there were those times when God protected Israel and in fact ordered Israel to kill all of these Canaanites, leaders and military personnel, as well as others. And the biblical narrative underscored the sovereignty of God over nations and God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. You know, the point I'm trying to make is it does not appear that God has a problem with the destruction of evil empires. The Bible teaches believers to be law-abiding citizens, to avoid civil disputes, and to show respect for all people in positions of authority. In Romans 13, verses 1 through 14, the Apostle Paul refers chiefly to the Christian's attitude toward human who are the governing authorities. It reads like this: everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in position of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. Now, this phrase, all authority comes from God, means that it is God. God is the one who established all ordained civil government. The original Greek word, exousia, is translated as an authority exerted by government officials. Christians are called to recognize and respect and submit to public officials as Lord's appointed servants, to restrain evil, punish disobedience, and carry out God's righteous will in society. Now, I know what you might be thinking right now. Wait a minute. What does this mean? All authority comes from God. Well, let me tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean blind, unreasoning obedience. A believer's allegiance is first and foremost to God. Now, suppose submission to human authority will cause us to disobey God and His Word. Well, in that case, we're to follow the example of Peter and the apostles. Remember what they said? They said, we must obey God rather than any human authority. Read that in Acts 5:29. God ultimately wants to draw all nations into the light of His Word. The Scripture reads, it is too light of a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. No, I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. And then in Jeremiah 5:28 and 29, God provides a warning to evil nations when His Word says, they have grown fat and sleek. They know no bounds in deeds of evil. They judge not with justice. They judge not with justice the cause of the fatherless, or to make it prosper, and they do not defend the rights of the needy. Shall I not punish them for these things? Declares the Lord. And shall I not avenge myself on a nation such as this? Now that's a direct warning. Furthermore, God disciplines the rulers of nations. In Daniel 2:20 and 21, we read, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Let me read that part again. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. In Genesis 9:6, God warns mankind. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in His own image. Now, as this podcast winds down today, let me just say to you what you already know. We live in a country that was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and we have a justice system that is built on Judeo-Christian principles. And our president, President Trump, has promised that as the United States facilitates the peaceful transfer of power in Venezuela, that justice and goodwill for the Venezuelan people will prevail. What should we be doing? We should be praying that the next leaders in Venezuela will be God-fearing people and committed to ending corruption at all levels. And we should be praying that religious freedom in Venezuela will be a concept that is mandated throughout that country. And we should be praying that economic stability will be achieved in a way that will eliminate widespread poverty that now grips the populace. Venezuela is a country that God has blessed with enviable natural resources. And because this country is so close to the United States geographically, future successes in Venezuela can have a dramatic impact on the safety and security of America. I'll just end this podcast by saying, may God bless the people of Venezuela and may God bless America. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you'll join us again in future podcasts. God bless.